Howdy folks, welcome back for another Feature Friday. I'm your host Ryan Glover, and this week we're going to wrap up our three-part series here on a process for building a feature. So up until now, if you haven't been following along, we've talked about my personal process for building a feature all the way from design mock-up all the way through implementation. And we haven't looked so much at the code, so if you've been watching these Feature Friday videos but you haven't seen the series yet, this is a little bit different because I haven't been talking so much about the code. There's been a little bit of code, but it's been more so about the theory and the logic that I use to build a feature. And the reason why is that I've found that, especially when I'm mentoring folks, that's where a lot of people get hung up. It's not so much in the technical aspects about like, well, what is the code that I write to make this thing come to life, but more so, how do I think or organize my thoughts in such a way that I can get this thing built? Because the reality with all this stuff, and I've mentioned this in the past two videos, which if you haven't checked out, so there's part one here and part two here, and these are linked below so you can get to them. But the process of building a feature, and this is pretty much any feature, so big or small, it doesn't matter if it's like a CRUD feature where it's just, you know, create, read, update, delete. So when you're building like a form that's going to write to a database, or it's something a little more technical like what we've been looking at, which is this revenue calculation tool. So I'm pulling data from a third-party API, and then I have to run a bunch of math calculations on that. It doesn't matter if it's either of those. It's no matter what you do, it's kind of overwhelming to do this stuff, especially if you're just getting started. And so this series has been all about, well, how do I keep myself focused, and how do I stay calm and organized enough to actually go from start to finish on a feature. So at this point, we're pretty much done. So like I mentioned, I think it was in part two, most of building a feature is just work. So I gave you a hint that one of the things that I do to make the process go a little bit smoother, a little bit faster, is that I rely heavily on patterns. So a lot of what we've done is looked at my usage of the action pattern. And this has come up in past Feature Fridays where we weren't getting into the theoretical aspects of building a feature. I actually showed you in process of how I use it. And the reason why is that it streamlines my thinking to the point where even if some of that pattern is unnecessary, I don't have to think about it. Meaning, when you're building features, you want to primarily focus your attention on how the feature works, not how the code that the feature is built with works. And the reason why is that that's just extra tax on your brain. And it's already hard enough to think through a feature, and the reason why is that it's creative. So this isn't something where you have like a paint by numbers necessarily, unless you're following a tutorial. But it's more of like an actual creative process where you have to think and you have to say like, well, I wonder what would happen if I do this, and then you have to try it. And that cycle and that process of iteration wears you down mentally, and so you got to keep that in mind. So relying on patterns is a way to not completely remove that tax. You're always going to tax your brain. That's why I'm a big proponent of when I'm doing this stuff, I just take it one bit at a time. It's like in the last video, we only talked about a little bit of stuff, and then I stopped and left myself a comment to kind of say like, here's where we left off and here's what to do. And I also explained that I would come back to that the next day. And that's super important. And that's just the reality of this beast is, I would say the majority of things that you're going to build and the majority of features that you're going to build in the product are going to be difficult enough that they're going to necessitate coming back over a series of days to complete them. So that's an important thing to keep in mind as you do this, is to get comfortable with taking it one step at a time. So don't get frustrated if you think that, like, so going in when you start building the feature, you think that you're going to finish it in a week and it actually takes 3. Don't get too fixated on the timeline. Get fixated on the feature itself and the quality of that feature. And so that's what I've been doing with this revenue stuff. So I've been working on this about, well, we're 3 videos deep, so about 3 weeks now. And over that time, I can tell you up front, I expected this to take me 2 weeks. And I expected it to take 2 weeks, not because of the videos, but I was really like, yeah, I can get that done in 2 weeks. But as this stuff unfolds, and this is something that you'll find, and this, I'm saying this because this still affects me as somebody who has quite a bit of experience doing this stuff. There's always more than you think there is. And it's not obvious. It never is. So, especially when you're dealing with stuff like this. So this is dealing with third-party APIs. So I'm pulling data from Stripe. And the first few versions, I think I mentioned this, I pulled the wrong data, or I didn't pull the data that I actually needed. So I had to go back and redo it. And again, it's that iterative cycle. So you have to get comfortable with investing time doing things that may not actually contribute to the end feature. They're contributing in a way, but they're not directly present, meaning it's work that you would have deleted, so you won't see it in the final code that actually gets shipped to production, but it is present in the kind of the historical matter. So just like you and I as humans, so there's things that I do that I don't know why I do them because one of my ancestors did them or one of my ancestors learned them. Your code, it's kind of trippy, but if you think about your code in the same way, this, like just the fact that I'm using this pattern, there's some ancestral history to it because I got to that point because I learned that that was the way that most, or that best mapped to how I think about building a product. And so now that's the way that I do things. So just the way that, like, I don't know, maybe you have a weird tick where you like scratch behind your ear or something like that. One of your ancestors for some reason was like, yeah, I got a scratch behind my ear right now. Or more specifically, it's probably in my best interest to run away from that rattling bush because there's probably something that's in it that wants to kill me. Whether or not there actually is, that's the kind of thinking that is worth keeping in mind as you go through this stuff. So looping back around to where we're at now. So I've actually gotten an opportunity to do quite a bit of work, and the bulk of this feature is getting built out. So this is a little more evolved than what you last saw. And that was primarily the end of last week. I had quite a bit of time to spend on this. So I spent a lot of time polishing up the UI and getting the actual data wired up. So you'll notice here, I don't think I had this tooltip in here. And so I've got that pulling the actual dates for the ranges and the amounts, and it tells me whether or not something went up or down. It tells me the percent changes over the last 30 days and all of that stuff. And I can show you all of that stuff, but it's the same exact point I was going to make as last week, which is it's just sitting down and doing the work and thinking through the problem no matter how long it takes. There's nothing magic. So the work that I was doing is the exact same work that I've been teaching you through all the other Feature Fridays and through this series, is it's just sitting down and thinking through the steps. So I make a big point, and I do this with myself, I do this with mentees and anybody else who asks me, think in steps. Because if you think in steps, it's a hell of a lot easier for you to break down a problem instead of getting overwhelmed by the whole scope of the thing. So if I think about the problem as, oh man, I got to import all this data from Stripe, and then I got to process it and run all these calculations, and I got to make sure that it's efficient, and I got to, you go down a rabbit hole that's not productive. Versus if I say, well, if I was going to build this feature, so if I was going to calculate revenue based on data from Stripe, what are the steps I would have to take? And I'm not going to elaborate on that because I talked about it quite a bit, I think, in one of the two videos that I've done so far. But just kind of reiterating that point, think in steps. So again, this is why I rely on this action pattern is, notice, it's very clear for me to understand. So I can come back to this later. I could come back to this months from now, and because it's a pattern that I understand and I've taken the time to learn, I can follow this code no matter what. And so that's something, again, that's the value of doing stuff like this, is it's for the moment. So it's for right now, for you right now, but it's also for you later. Because the reality of software is that stuff breaks, stuff changes, and you want your code to be as easily changed as possible or as easily fixed as possible if something's going wrong. And so again, that's where patterns come in and that's where steps go in. So up until this point now, I can walk through this and I can say, okay, what's the step that I have to do? Well, I have to get a product. I have to figure out who the payment processor is that I'm importing for. I got it out this time. I remember last time I was stuttering on payment processor. There we go. I was practicing. So I've got my payment processor. I've got queuing the import, and then I get into my calculations and stuff like that. So The point here isn't necessarily the work that's being done, but it's that the way that I solve this problem. And that's how I consider it. So a feature is a problem. Think of it like a math problem on a test that you have to solve. And you think about like, well, a lot of teachers will give you credit for showing your work. So if you like show how you got to the solution, that's another way that I think about this stuff is like, well, I'm showing my work. Like, how did I get to the solution of having data to put on screen inside of this chart? Because at the end of the day, that's all that's happening. I'm just saying, okay, given some inputs, I need data that I can display on a chart. That's it. And so it's important also not to over mystify this stuff. It's not anything that crazy when you think about it. It's like, well, I have an object or an array of objects, and I'm going to send those over the internet down to a browser, and then the browser is going to render them in some way. So in this instance, it's rendering that data as a chart, but it could just as well be, you know, like if we go over to cards, it could be a list of this. So it's worth not getting caught up in the woo of building software. It's like the reality is like it's at its core, it's not that complicated. So don't make it more complicated than it needs to be. So at this point, now that I've gotten all this code written, my next process, and this is where I start to differ a little bit from some of the more veteran developers, at least a certain subset. And so you've probably been wondering at some point in this, like, well, when's he going to test this? Like, how does he test this? And so that's what I want to focus on for the remainder of this video is like, well, what's my approach to testing and how do I do it? Because there's ultimately no definitive way to do testing. You know, there's certain philosophies and theories and tools and stuff, but there's never like a concrete way of doing it. It's always personal either to yourself or if you're a part of a team, it's personal to that team. And so the way that I think about testing is enough to confirm that this is going to behave how I think it should behave. And that is super friggin' subjective. So if you're like shaking your fist at the screen, I understand. But what I mean by that is, and if we take this into more technical terms, so the way that I think about testing my applications, I have a few different tests. So I've got my unit tests, which are if I want to test a function, so like get random color array. And we can see this one's evolved quite a bit. So let's pick something a little more complicated. So like get username, and we can see I've got a test here for it. So getting a username is a unit. That's very simple. I give it an input, it gives me a very predictable output. It's tiny, it's a unit. So that's one type of test that I think about. The other, and this is the one that I focus a lot of my effort on, is the integration test. So integration tests are a little more heavy duty. So I don't think I've started any of these yet. But let's find, I want to say into my customers directory, I've got some stuff. Yes, I do. So integration tests are integrating multiple pieces of the application or multiple units. I'm hesitant to say multiple units because it's not just testing the individual units, but basically the idea is in my application some process. So like here I've got my create customer action. That is integrating multiple parts or multiple features or pieces of my application. So what I mean by that is it's integrating calls to the database. It's integrating calls to the Stripe API. I guess that's it in this file. So it's integrating those two pieces, and while an integration test is going to help me make sure that those two pieces play well together, but also that they produce the end result that I expect when they play well together. So I'm trying to confirm not just that I can create a customer, but when I do that, are the parts that I'm using to create that customer messing each other up in any way. So I might test the individual Stripe function. I wouldn't, but assuming that that was something I wrote internally, I might test that as a unit, and I might test my database writes as a unit, but then I'll write the integration test to see how those parts play together. So there's that. And then the third, and this one I use sparingly for a very good reason, which is the end-to-end test, or some people call them functional tests, or I've heard them even referred to as like behavioral tests. And that's when you're testing in the browser. So that stuff, and again, I use it very sparingly, but let's see what I've got. And that'll kind of give you a hint at how much of this I've done. So I want to say, do I have sign up test? No. Login test? No. Let's see. Let's do a search. So we're going to say, so I use the .e to e syntax. Oh, I actually don't have any in here right now. And that's not a total surprise. Is that true? Let's do a search. E to e. No. And that's all get cache, so I've just got that. So to explain it, end-to-end tests are when you're automating actual user functionality in the browser. So for example, I would have an end-to-end test that says, go to this URL, click this button, fill in this input, fill in this other input, and then click this button, and then confirm that whatever that collection of actions did actually resulted in what I expected. So in this case, I'm trying to test, if I was writing an end-to-end test for this, that I can add a new card via the global add a new card button. So that's my test, with the end result being that the card either ends up in the database or I can see myself calling to send that data that makes up this form to the database. So it's literally saying, is my code in the browser doing what I would expect? So if somebody's clicking around, is it doing what I expect? And it's literally automating user behavior. So like I said, like click, you're going to write code that says something like some button selector dot click, some input dot focus, some input dot fill. And then you're going to write all of those in sequence. So just like we talked about on the server side with all the steps in an action, same exact idea for an end-to-end test. You're saying, click this, fill this out, do this, then click the submit button, then verify that that works. So that's an end-to-end test. And the reason, so I should give a why, like why don't I use those as much as I do unit and integration tests. And the reason why is that, especially with me, so this is more personal to me, but UI changes a lot for me. So like we just saw over the past few weeks, like this looks completely different from the way that the UI looked in the current production version of command. So if we go to command right now and we pull this up, like this looks completely different from this. And like I explained, I just kind of had a brainwave a few weeks ago and I was like, well, let me go ahead and change it. So the reason that presents a problem for end-to-end tests is that your end-to-end tests are literally dependent on the UI to some extent. And there's some clever tricks that you can use to kind of mitigate your end-to-end test constantly breaking, but I've found that they're kind of like they don't work that well. So what I found is like, and to make that super concrete, so if I was going to say click on this button and I wanted to write an end-to-end test for it, I would have to specify a CSS selector to get to that button. Now, one of the tricks that I've used in the past is instead of doing, so let's actually inspect some HTML here so we can see what I'm talking about. So technically I could write in end-to-end test where I say, okay, when the product navigation dot fur button primary is clicked, or that's what I want. Let me say that in another way. So my end-to-end test is trying to say click through there, click this thing. So I'm saying click or run a click handler on product navigation dot fur button primary. So if I do that, that means that that test is 100% dependent on those class names and that structure staying the same. So that means that I can't necessarily change product navigation's name to something like just navigation. And if I wanted to give this button a more specific name, like here I've got add new card button, any changes that I make to those values are going to affect my test because the tests are dependent on those things existing. And so one of the tricks that I do with end-to-end tests, but it's kind of, again, it's kind of goofy. So if you go back, I've got another Feature Friday, and I'll link this below as well. So that's on end-to-end testing with the framework that I use called Test Cafe. I really like it. So I go through in detail, and I actually show you writing these. So instead of me just kind of blabbing on here, you'll actually see me doing this, but in the context of a test. So what I like to do is I'll have something like a data test attribute on the element, and then I'll tell myself what it is. So I'll say like add, so data test add new card. So the benefit of this is that no matter what in my test, I can say, and it'll look something like this. So I'll say click, and this isn't exact, but this will give you a gist. So I would say click data.test equals add new card, something like that. So what's neat about that is not only does it communicate back to me that this is intended for a test, but it does also give me access pretty much indefinitely to that element, because there's no reason that I would change the data test attribute, but I will likely change at some point maybe the class names of the button or the way that it's structured. So instead of saying something like this, so just can I keep that in scope? I can. Nice. So we're gonna say, if I did like product navigation dot fur button primary. So notice the difference between those two selectors. So one is hyper specific and dependent on context, and one isn't. So one is just saying this is the add new card button that's going to be used for tests. That's it. There's an obvious drawback to that, which is now in order to do your end-to-end test, you're having to litter your code with all these data test attributes. And if you're part of a team, you have to explain that to people. So if that's not that big of a cost or a pain point for you, I think it's a great way to do it. But again, the cost of that is totally up to you. And again, my concern is always more on the server side part of this stuff working more than it is on the client side. And the reason why is that, and this is slightly hubristic, but I've been doing front-end development long enough that I trust pretty much everything that I'm doing, at least on the basic stuff. Whereas like certain UIs, I may not trust myself as much, so I'll write end-to-end tests for that. But again, I just use it sparingly. That doesn't mean that I'm saying you shouldn't write end-to-end tests, or if you're not as experienced doing front-end development, that you shouldn't do end-to-end tests. I actually, if I could go back in time, I would say that if I was just getting started as a front-end developer, I would actually prefer to have end-to-end testing in my toolbox, because I didn't when I first started, and a lot of my understanding and learning of this was trial and error. So having those tools at your disposal as you're learning how to build UIs, super, super helpful. So if you're just starting to get the bearings with this stuff and you're not confident that the UIs that you're building are going to work the way you think they're going to, write some end-to-end tests. And by extension, there's another side to this that I don't do as much of, but I actually will do this. So the UI framework that I'm building this with called Fur, and if you haven't checked that out, go to cleverbeagle.com/fur. That UI kit that I'm building, another form of end-to-end testing or a type of testing that you can do is actually testing your React components. So because that CSS framework is going to be built around a set of React components, I'm going to write tests, and there's a framework for this. Oh, I know this, called Enzyme, that helps you render React components in your tests. So again, I'm not doing any of that in here right now, but that's another option if you're not 100% confident in what your UI is doing, to write end-to-end tests to make sure that everything's doing what you think. So there's that. So that was a very long explanation of end-to-end testing and how I think about that. But kind of getting back to what I would do on the server side. So like we saw a few minutes ago, I haven't really done any testing yet. And I started to make a hint about this. So where I differ from some veteran engineers is that some will do or follow a philosophy known as TDD, or test-driven development. And so that's a complete 180 on how you might think about building a feature or building software. So TDD takes the approach of I'm going to write tests first, and I'm going to write, more specifically, I'm going to write failing tests first, and then I'm going to write code to make those tests pass. So you'll hear the phrase in TDD, red, green, refactor. So you say, write the test, it's red, meaning it failed, and then the next step is, okay, write enough code to make that test go green, and then the next part is refactor that code to just improve the code overall. And so that gap between green and refactor that's where it just becomes an experiential thing. Like you have to say, how how can you have to know, how do I improve this code, or how might I go about improving this code? So there's that. So that's one way of thinking about it. Again, that's test first, and then you're kind of writing the code to resolve the test. My brain doesn't work well like that. It does on a small scale, so if I'm writing unit tests or like small units, like little modules, I can do that. But when it comes to big stuff, so like importing Stripe data and going through all these steps, it's a nightmare. It takes me 10 times as long to do the same work versus me just writing the code and then going back and writing the test, which is what I like to do. So again, what I do with actions is I write my integration tests. And this is the other nice part about actions is I've drawn a clear boundary around a task. And so I can test that that one task does its job and does it the way I expect it to. And so what I'll do, and we'll do it, I'm trying to think which part of this is going to be easiest for a video. And this is the other thing. So the other reason I do this separately is I treat this as usually being about the same amount of work as doing the actual development itself. So it does take some time. So let's see here. We've got import. There's another part of this. So there's get revenue triggers the import. Get revenue, what are you up to? You get a product, you get the payment processor, data for period. I think this one's going to be a little bit easier to start with. And technically that makes sense because this is the start of the chain of events that we've been talking about. Yeah. Let's do this one. So what I'm going to do is jump over to this file. So I created the placeholder, but I haven't filled it out yet. And the reason why is that I wanted to make a callback to something we talked about before, which is snippets. So I'm lazy. Since you're a developer, you're probably lazy too. And so what I just wrote there was ACT test. So not the actual ACT test if you're in the US. It's not that, which was horrible, by the way. I didn't enjoy that. But in this case, this is an action test. So that was my shorthand for spitting out a mocked out version of an integration test for an action. So again, the point of this is once you do this stuff enough, you're going to get to the point where you're not going to want to write all this boilerplate over and over. And so it's worth taking the time to go and create a snippet so that you can just do what I did and then just get straight to work. You don't have to think like, what do I import into this? Or like, how does the test, like, you don't have to think about that. You can just spit it out and get to work. So the next part of this, and let's just start this because again, this is going to take me a few hours to get this fully complete, but let's go through here. So we're going to import and you'll notice up here I have placeholders. So I've got the action name. So get revenue is going to import this from right here. So I'm putting my test files right next to my actual code. And so I've got get revenue as my function, and down here I've got that. And you'll notice that I'm using async await here. So I'm using Jest to write my tests. And if you haven't checked this out, if you go to cleverbeagle.com/pup and you click on read the docs, I've got full documentation on the testing that's in play here. So again, I use pup, which is the boilerplate I use with mentees, to build commands. So it's the same exact tooling, same everything. So if you read the docs there, it'll explain exactly what's going on here. But what I'm doing is I'm writing a test in Jest, and I'm saying, okay, this is going to be async await, and the reason why is that I know that this action is wrapped by a promise. So earlier when we were working on this, I think I showed you packed, so promise action or promised action. So what that's doing is it's allowing me to wait on that thing to complete before I continue some other code. So in this case, I need to make sure that my test waits on that code to run before I actually try and verify that something happened or that something worked. And so what we're going to do, because I'm looking at the clock and I have a dentist appointment I need to get to, so we're gonna write a test for, at the very least, this. So we've got get product, and if we look at that function, we're saying product find one. So what we're going to do, so you notice I've got my placeholder for my test here, does this thing. I'm going to say gets the product. Now, this is the fun part of testing. So technically, I'm in the camp where I'm against actually reading and writing from a live database inside of your tests. I found that that causes some serious havoc. So you'll notice here I've put in some mocks that I want to use for this. So what I'm going to do is create what am I doing? I'm doing a find one. So I'm going to mock out products. There you go. Products.find one. And we can see that I'm doing two things. Let's import that up at the top. So again, I've got a placeholder here for products. However, this is the wrong path. So we got to go, where are we? Revenue actions. Ah, there we go. Just lean on the IDE for this one. There we go. That's the right path. So what I'm doing is I'm importing products, which is the actual constructor function for the products collection, or the pointer to the products collection. But what I'm doing before each test is I'm telling Jess to mock it. So I'm creating a fake version of that collection constructor. And so what I'm doing is I'm saying, I know that I'm going to call to products.find1, so I want to mock that function. And so the very first thing that I do is I reset it. So again, notice that I'm calling this in before each. So I'm saying before each test. So if I was to duplicate this and do another test and I called the same code, I want to make sure that I completely reset that mock. And the reason why is that mock functions are functions essentially, so I can change the internal state of that function, so like the data that it has internally. So I want to make sure I reset that, and then I've got find one mock implementation. So the way that I mock implement this depends on my level of patience. So, and again, you want to make sure that you're testing your code, not somebody else's code. So in this case, products.find1 is something from Meteor. So they have a MongoDB adapter that they've written, and I want to assume as a developer that they've done their job. Just because this has been around so long, I know that that's the case, but this is pretty much applying to any third-party code that's not yours. You want to just assume that their code works. So I don't need to test their code. I need to test my code. So in this case, my code is this action file, or this action JavaScript, where I'm saying, okay, I need to get the revenue, and as a part of that, I expect to get a product back here. That's it. So what I want to confirm is that product find one was called. That's it. Because that's part of the action. So in the process of getting the revenue, getting the product is part of that. So I need to make sure that it attempts to get a product. I don't care that products.find1 actually returns a real live product. So what I'm going to do, and you'll notice here that products find one mock implementation, I can specify how I want Jest to implement or mock this function. So in this case, I'm going to pass it a function that returns a value. So what I'm saying is when products find one is called, inside of the scope of my test, I want to return a fake product or a mock product. So I'm just going to say ID is product 1, 2, 3, and let's make sure, what else are we expecting? So if we go to the second step, get payment processor, we're saying we expect integrations, at least in this case, integration Stripe to be there. So let's say we'll just fake the integration Stripe, and we'll say, I'm looking on my other screen here because I actually have this data up, so I can say, all right, so we'll just fake, we'll say access token. What's the structure of that for them? Ah, beautiful. So we'll say SK test 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So what I'm doing, and why do I have a, oh, because that's a function body, not an object. So I need to do something like that, right? Yeah. Okay, so what this is going to do, no matter what, every time I call products find one, it's going to return this exact object. And you'll notice that I'm not mocking out the entire product structure, which is, goodness, it's probably got to be somewhere in 30 to 40 lines of different data points. But I'm only adding what I really need to verify that this code was called and that it works. And so what I'm going to do, I'm going to say gets the product, and I'm going to call get revenue. So get revenue expects some inputs. What does it expect? Product ID, type, start date, and end date. Good Lord. So this is what I'm talking about. This is a thinker. So what we're going to do is up here I've got test data, and this is basically this is my input into my function. So I'm just going to mock this out for everything. So product ID, I'm just going to say is product 1, 2, 3, and then I'm going to do type, start date, end date. So type is, this is the type of calculation I'm getting the revenue for. So this is MR, monthly recurring revenue. And I'm going to do start date and end date, which should be ISO strings. So what we're going to do is jump in the browser. And again, in tests, the specific data doesn't really matter that much, just that the format of it is correct and is what the function will expect. So I should be able to get away with this. So we're going to say I want to get the data for, let's go back 2 days. So we'll say the 12th to today. And let's see here. So I'm passing that when I run my test. So I say test data. And the reason I just did that, so my code, if it's running correctly, is going to throw an error immediately when I run this test because it's going to say, wait a minute, you didn't pass these values in. So again, the very first thing that I call is validate options to make sure that the inputs are correct. So if we didn't do what we just did, this code would fail. My test would fail because it's like, wait a minute, it threw an error when I didn't pass this stuff in. So that's why we just did that. So now looking at get product again, what we're going to do is say expect, in this case, I expect products.find1. And we can see my test is already mocked out because, again, this is a pattern that I use to make sure that my tests are consistent. So I'm saying I want to expect products find one to have been called 1 times, and I expect it to have been called with. And when we say call with, we mean literally the inputs to the function. So I need to copy this. And in this case, because I've passed in my test data, so here I've got product ID as a variable, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to say product123, and the reason why is that that's what I've put in my test data here, which is my input here, which is what my code is dependent on, meaning if we look, I've got product ID coming in to get product here, but what I'm doing is I'm saying pull options.product ID. So inside of my test, this is representing options, so I have to take from that test data object. I have to say, okay, well, that's the value that I expect. So if I change this to 456, I would expect it to be product ID or product 456. So that's what we're after there. So next, there we go, is the actual code that I'm running here for fields. So again, we got to make sure that the inputs are the exact same because this is what I expect the code to be doing. So if this test were to fail, well, that tells me that it's not doing what it's supposed to do. So I'm going to save this, and I've got my test running in another file, and it is going whole hog. All right, what do we got here? Cannot set an undefined handler. Okay, so this is the sticky part of tests, and this is something that I'm going to have to come back to because this is going to be involved. So what's going on here is, let's go back to get revenue real quick. What's going on here is I've got this queue payment processor import, and actually, you know what? Let's see if we can get away with this. I have a feeling we can. So what I'm doing, I'm just preventing all the other code in here from running. We're going to see if it lets me run the test. All right, what do we get? Where are you coming from? Oh, that's in the actual import. So let's knock out this. So what's going on here is queue payment processor import. That is using another library that I haven't mocked yet in my code. And so it's technically being loaded into memory, but Jess doesn't know how to handle it. There we go. So we can see, so all of these are just telling me that I've written my test files as placeholders, but I haven't written tested them. So the test that was just failing passes now, and the reason why is that what we just tested for products find one, that actually worked. But the thing that was failing is I haven't mocked a part of this action, and so it's going to fail. It doesn't know what to do when it loads that into memory. So that's something I'm going to have to fight with later. But so let's trying to think of how we can get around this or what we can do next. That's like literally the third step in this. Where'd it go? There it is. So we can say get payment processor. So let's look at that function, and we expect it to return something like this. And the reason why, so I have all these different conditionals, and again, I haven't implemented these other platforms yet. This is just me kind of speccing this out, but what I've got here, I know that Stripe is going to work, and if we go back to our test, I can see that, did I do it? Where did I do that? Oh, I'm looking right at it. I did it right here. So I've set the expectation that my product is going to have the Stripe integration enabled. So what I want to do is make sure that when I say, and this is literally the fun of testing, is you got to go back and forth, back and forth. So I expect, where'd it go? Okay, so what am I expecting? Get payment processor. So I don't really care about this function. This is going to affect future stuff. So I'm going to stop here because this is going to get a little bit heady. But the point being with all this, again, we're trying to talk through the logic of doing this. This is literally probably easily my next week and a half, is sitting here writing tests for all the different parts. So up until now, we've talked about get revenue. We've talked about, let's get rid of this. We talked about get revenue. We've talked about importing Stripe data. And I want to say we talked about calculate monthly recurring revenue too. And if not, basically this function, again, another action, is just going through the process of saying, okay, given all of the data that I have in my database that I imported from Stripe, go and calculate that product's monthly recurring revenue. And so it goes through a number of different steps. It says, okay, well, we have to get all the events that fit between the start and end date that the user specified. So again, that's this start and end date up here. So again, if I change this, we'll say all time, just so it's dramatic. Did I delete my connection? I did. Save. Let's refresh that. Oh, because I broke our function here, so it's not working. So this is the joy of this stuff. So we're testing get revenue, but get revenue is currently busted, so that's not going to work. But that date range, so if I set that date range, it's going to do that, and then it's going to go in the database, it's going to find all the data, and then it's going to do the hard stuff, which is grouping together data, processing the numbers, making sure it's all right. So again, that's just following through that process and doing it. So the best thing I can say in that regard to getting from, okay, I have the idea and I understand the problem, to finishing it, is you really have to focus yourself. And most people get mad at me when I say that. They're like, what do you mean focus myself? It's like, well, and if you haven't listened yet, I don't know if it's out yet. It's probably going to be out. I think it comes out Monday or the week after. But the podcast that I do with my buddy Alex Price for Clever Beagle, it's called Eye for Detail. So we talk about distraction and all that stuff. And one of the things we talk about, and I do have it on me, is this guy. So cell phones. So one of the big things that I'll do during my day is I'll tap the, I don't know if you can see it, but I'll tap the do not disturb, or I'll go put it out in the kitchen. So I won't have my phone next to me at all day. So focus is as much as you put into it. So it's like anything else in life. You have to create an environment where you can focus. So that's part one. So you're not constantly distracted by binging and bonging. Like turn off the notifications on your computer, close your fucking email inbox. Like just tune yourself in. But then, and this is a discipline thing, which is you have to follow through. There's no other way to get this stuff done. So what I mean by that is once you start on something, so once you start on a feature, finish it. Don't just say, oh, well, you know, I'm going to start it halfway and it kind of works, and then I'm going to move over here and do this other thing. And then I'm going to get mad because nothing works and it's not good and people aren't giving me money. And it's like they're not giving you money because you've half-assed it. So what you need to do is sit down and say, like right here, like I said, I've been working on this one feature for 3 weeks. So every time, no matter where I get to that day, I stop and then I come back and I pick up on it and I finish it completely. So that's it. That's how you do it. It's not magic. It's not special. You just have to chew through it and work the problem until you solve it and not get fussy when it gets hard. You have to say like, well, if I want this thing to exist, especially as I see it in my head, I have to follow through. I have to make the effort to get it done. And that takes as long as it takes. So I know it's unfortunate, but in the corporate world, everybody's losing their damn marbles about sprints and deadlines. And there's a reason that there's a lot of garbage in the world. That's one of them, which is we're forcing ourselves to create stuff on a strict schedule so that some manager looks good to his boss, not because we're concerned about building a good product. So that's the way that I've chosen to differentiate myself and think about this, and I so far that's played out in my favor. So I would suggest to at least consider it for yourself, which is start on the feature, work the problem, and build the feature until you finish, and then move on to the next thing. And that's how you do it. So again, like I'm saying with this testing stuff, technically this feature is done. I've implemented the basic parts of it. I have to add some other calculations, but primarily that's copy and paste. So I could rush through this and say, you know what, screw it, it's done. I'm going to push it into production and that's it. But I'll know in the back of my head, well, I didn't really test it that well. I didn't test all the considerations, so the feature's not done. And so you have to set that expectation and have that discipline on yourself to say, okay, I've got to do all of the work and I've got to follow through from start to finish. If you're serious, if you want to actually do this stuff. If you don't, it's fine. If you're just playing and you're learning and you're getting comfortable with the concepts, it's okay to like put stuff down. But if you're really trying to build your own product and you want it to be good and you want it to be something that you can make a predictable, good living off of and hopefully make yourself wealthy from, you have to do this shit. It's not easy. It's not fun all the time. I love it, but you know, I can understand why some people wouldn't because it's a little tedious. But you have to follow through and you have to develop that discipline. And the only way to develop it is to do it. And it hurts and it sucks. But eventually you get into a groove with it. And again, following patterns and using a consistent process is what's going to help you follow through with this stuff more often than not. So that's going to do it for me. I need to jet. Thanks for watching. Hopefully this series was helpful. Hopefully it's something that, I know it's been long, I've been talking a lot, but hopefully the ideas that I'm sharing with you are helpful, because this is literally how I think about this stuff. You know, short of what I've explained to you in these videos, it's me sitting in a room mostly alone for hours on end. And when I say hours on end, I mean like 8 hours, 12 hours, 16 hours, or like back in the day when it was just, you know, I only had a little bit of time, like 1 hour in the morning or 2 hours in the morning. It was just doing that, but doing it again and again and again and again over time. So hopefully that part of this is helpful and helps to demystify a little bit how I think about this stuff, because I know it can be frustrating when you have an idea in your head and you can't quite get it out. And I think stuff like this might help. At least I think it would have helped to pass me if I would have known then what I know now, if that makes any sense. So that's going to do it for me. So if you haven't already, make sure to hit the subscribe button down below and hit the bell right next to it if you want to get notifications as soon as these go live. And signing off for the HMS Beagle, I'll see you next week, folks.